Have you ever felt like you don't belong in this world? That there's something deeply wrong with the way everyone lives, works, relates to each other? This feeling of being a stranger in your own time isn't new, and few writers have captured this feeling with as much intensity as Hermann Hesse. He wrote for the lonely ones, for those who can't fit in. His characters are steppenwolves, spiritual seekers, young people suffocated by expectations. The question that runs through all his work is simple and devastating. If modern society distances us from ourselves, where can we find true meaning? Hermann Hesse was born in 1877 in a small German town, but his upbringing was anything but ordinary. His parents were Christian missionaries with deep experience in India. His maternal grandfather had been a Protestant missionary in Calcutta and a scholar of Asian languages and religions. His mother was born in India and spoke Hindi, Tamil, and other languages fluently. The house was filled with books about Buddhism, Hinduism, Asian philosophy. While other German children grew up in purely Western environments, Hesse breathed a cultural mixture that would mark him forever. This spiritual richness came accompanied by intense pressure. His parents had clear plans. They wanted him to become a pastor, to follow the family tradition of serving God. The young Hesse didn't fit into this plan. He was sensitive, introspective, questioning. The rigid educational system of 19th century Germany, with its military discipline and blind obedience, suffocated him. At 14, he entered the seminary at Maulbronn, designed to train future theologians. He lasted only a few months. The pressure became unbearable. Hesse fled from the seminary, was found and returned. Then came the suicide attempt. His parents, desperate, committed him to an institution for the mentally ill and epileptics. There, tied to a bed, the teenager confronted the inner abyss that would accompany him for his entire life. This experience wasn't just a passing crisis. It was his first conscious contact with the fundamental fracture between the sensitive individual and oppressive social structures. He discovered that he couldn't live according to imposed rules, but he also didn't know how to live outside them. His escape valve was nature. Hesse fled to the forests, spent hours observing rivers, trees, animals. There, far from churches and classrooms, he found something civilization didn't offer: a sense of peace, of natural belonging, of connection with something greater than human conventions. Unable to continue his formal studies, Hesse was forced to work. He became an apprentice in a clock factory, spending entire days in mechanical and repetitive work. The experience was devastating for his artistic soul, but also revealing. He saw firsthand how industrial modernity transformed human beings into gears in a larger machine. Salvation came when he got a job in a bookstore in Tübingen. There, surrounded by books, he discovered his true path. He devoured works by Nietzsche, which freed him from the weight of traditional Christian morality. He plunged into German romanticism of Novalis and Hölderlin, who celebrated nature and subjectivity. He studied the ancient Greek philosophers, especially the pre-Socratics, who saw nature as the essence of everything. Nietzsche was particularly transformative. The idea that traditional morality was just a human construction, that the individual should create their own values, that art and greatness were superior to mere moral virtue, all of this resonated deeply with Hesse's inner revolt. He was beginning to build his own philosophy, one that rejected both his parents' religion and the empty materialism of industrial society. In 1904, Hesse published his first successful novel, Peter Kamenzind. The story of a young man who leaves his mountain village to seek meaning in the big city, only to discover emptiness and artificiality, was clearly autobiographical. The protagonist, like Hesse, finds only in nature the meaning that modern civilization can't offer. The novel struck a nerve in an entire generation of young Europeans who felt suffocated by industrial modernity. Hesse became known as the spokesperson for those who couldn't accept mechanized urban life, the obsession with material progress, the abandonment of the natural rhythms of existence. But this initial success was just the beginning. Hesse still had to confront the deeper layers of his existential crisis. He married, had 3 children, tried to establish a normal life. But even in family life, he found no peace. In 1906, he published Beneath the Wheel, a devastating critique of the German educational system. The novel tells the story of Hans Giebenrath, a talented young man destroyed by academic pressure. The expectations of parents, teachers, of society itself crush his sensitivity and creativity. In the end, the young man dies by drowning. Hesse makes it clear: society killed this boy through its supposedly civilizing institutions. The message was direct. Modern education doesn't form complete human beings, but obedient servants of the system. It doesn't awaken individuality, but crushes it. And the most sensitive ones, those who could contribute something genuinely new to the world, are precisely those who suffer the most. Hesse was channeling his own pain, his own experience of nearly being destroyed by the German educational system. And he was warning that this wasn't an individual problem, but a structural one. In 1911, finally realizing a childhood dream, Hesse traveled to India, Ceylon, and Malaya. He hoped to find the spiritual wisdom he had idealized through his grandfather's books and his mother's stories. But reality was disappointing. He discovered that the real East was also contaminated by modernization, by colonialism, by the same loss of authenticity he criticized in the West. The Hindus and Buddhists he met weren't the enlightened sages of his imagination, but ordinary people dealing with the same universal human problems. This disillusionment led him back to Schopenhauer, the German philosopher who had integrated Buddhism into Western thought. Schopenhauer argued that all suffering comes from desire, from the will to live that drives us blindly. Wisdom would consist of denying this will, of reaching a kind of nirvana through aesthetic contemplation and compassion. But Hesse perceived a contradiction. If enlightenment requires denying the world, why did so many Eastern sages live ordinary lives? Why did the Buddha himself, after his enlightenment, return to teach in the world? These questions would plant the seeds of Siddhartha. Then came World War I, and everything collapsed. While most German intellectuals supported militaristic nationalism, Hesse took a radical position. He published pacifist articles, arguing that the war was a collective madness, a manifestation of the spiritual disease of modern Europe. The reaction was brutal. The German press attacked him as a traitor. He received threatening letters. Friends abandoned him. His wife, already psychologically fragile, went into total collapse. His youngest son became seriously ill. His father died. Hesse was being destroyed from all sides. But he didn't back down. He continued arguing that the mass violence of war was a direct consequence of Europe's abandonment of its spiritual soul. Modernity had created powerful machines, but emptied the human being of meaning. The inevitable result was organized barbarism. Hesse was seeing his worst predictions come true. The society he had criticized in his novels was now killing millions of young men in trenches. In despair, he sought psychological help. He was treated by Joseph Lang, a direct disciple of Carl Jung, and later met Jung himself. This encounter was revolutionary. Jung offered an alternative to the Freudian vision of the psyche. Instead of seeing the unconscious only as a repository of repressed traumas, Jung saw in it a creative and transformative potential. The process of individuation, becoming truly who you are, required confronting inner shadows, integrating rejected aspects of personality, reconciling opposites within oneself. Hesse plunged into this therapeutic work with intensity. He drew mandalas, painted images of the unconscious, explored his dreams, and he began writing Demian, a novel that directly incorporated Jungian insights. The book tells the story of Emile Sinclair, a young man divided between the luminous world of social conventions and the dark world of instincts and authenticity. The title character, Demian, acts as a spiritual guide, teaching Sinclair that good and evil are artificial constructions, that the divine contains both light and darkness, that true strength comes from embracing the entire reality of oneself. After the war, divorced and exhausted, Hesse moved to a simple house in Ticino, the Italian region of Switzerland. He lived alone, by a river, in almost total isolation. There, in solitude and nature, he finally found inner peace. He began painting watercolors obsessively, landscapes, trees, rivers. Painting became a form of meditation, a path to silence the chattering mind and simply be present. And it was in this contemplative state, listening to the river flow day and night, that he wrote Siddhartha. The novel was published in 1922 and would become his most influential work. But curiously, at the time of its publication, it was received with relative indifference. Only decades later, in the 1960s, when the Western counterculture turned to the East, Siddhartha became a global phenomenon. Hesse had written a book ahead of its time, one that would speak directly to future generations searching for something beyond materialism and social conventions. Siddhartha is the story of a young Brahmin who isn't satisfied with religious rituals. He wants to experience enlightenment directly. Along with his friend Govinda, he abandons comfortable life and joins the samanas, ascetics who practice extreme denial of the body. But after years of fasting and meditation, he realizes he's only running from himself through self-imposed suffering. Then he meets Gautama, the Buddha, already enlightened and surrounded by disciples. Govinda decides to follow him, but Siddhartha refuses. His explanation is the philosophical heart of the book. He believes the Buddha achieved enlightenment, but doubts that this knowledge can be transmitted. Each person must find their own path. You can't learn to be enlightened by reading about enlightenment. Siddhartha then plunges into the opposite world. He becomes the lover of Kamala, a courtesan, and partner of a wealthy merchant. For years he experiences sensual and material pleasures, but the emptiness returns. Both extreme asceticism and extreme indulgence are ways of avoiding confronting who we really are. In despair, Siddhartha returns to the river where, years before, he had crossed to enter the world of the senses. He contemplates throwing himself into the waters and ending it all. But something stops him. The sound of the river speaking Om, the sacred syllable of unity. He finds Vasudeva, the ferryman who had taken him across years before. Vasudeva becomes his final teacher, not through words or doctrines, but through the simple act of listening to the river. The river teaches through its own being. It flows constantly, but remains the same. Every drop of water is different, but all are water. The river is simultaneously at its source, in its middle, and at its mouth. There is no past and future in the river, only the eternal present. Through years of listening to the river with Vasudeva, Siddhartha achieves enlightenment. He understands that everything is interconnected, that there's no real separation between self and world, that time is an illusion of human consciousness. The same life flows through all forms, like water flows through the river. When Govinda, now an old monk, meets his friend again, he doesn't recognize in him the Buddha he'd searched for his entire life. But Siddhartha smiles. Enlightenment isn't about appearing enlightened, but simply being. There's no title, no special position, no external authority. There's only the direct experience of unity with everything that exists. The central message of Siddhartha is revolutionary. Knowledge can be taught, but wisdom cannot. You can learn facts about enlightenment, but you can't learn to be enlightened. That only comes through direct experience. Hesse argues that all profound truths contain their opposites. The saint and the sinner are the same from the perspective of unity. Good and evil are two sides of a deeper reality. Suffering and joy are inseparable. Wanting only one side creates inner conflict. This philosophy has roots in Taoism and Mahayana Buddhism, which emphasize non-duality. But Hesse expresses it in a way particularly accessible to Western thought. It's not necessary to deny the world or suppress desires, but rather to see them as part of a larger whole. Language and concepts, however sophisticated, always create artificial divisions. They cut reality into pieces that exist only in thought. True wisdom is beyond words, in the direct experience of unity. But Hesse wasn't simply a Westerner appropriating Eastern ideas. His relationship with Buddhism and Hinduism was complex and critical. He rejected the life-denying aspect in certain interpretations of Buddhism. For Hesse, influenced by Nietzsche, denial of the world and instincts was a form of cowardice disguised as spirituality. True wisdom didn't consist of fleeing from life, but of affirming it completely. This included embracing the shadow aspects, the animal instincts, everything that religion and society tried to suppress. What Hesse admired in Eastern thought was its holistic vision of consciousness, its understanding that rational mind is only a small part of who we are. The East had preserved a connection with intuitive, non-verbal wisdom that the rationalist West had lost. But the true source of this wisdom, for Hesse, wasn't in temples or monasteries, but in nature. The river in Siddhartha isn't a Buddhist symbol, it's nature itself teaching. Eastern sages had access to this wisdom, not because their religions were superior, but because their cultures maintained a closer relationship with the natural world. If in Siddhartha Hesse explored reconciliation with the world through acceptance and unity, his next major work would be born from a completely opposite place. Despite the apparent serenity he found writing about the river and enlightenment, Hesse was still far from having achieved lasting inner peace in his own life. His second marriage, to Ruth Wenger, quickly deteriorated. He felt misunderstood, lonely, alienated even within his own home. In 1924, he entered one of his deepest psychological crises. He felt divided between the desire to live fully and contempt for the mediocre society that surrounded him. He loved art, music, intellect, but despised the satisfied and conformist bourgeoisie. He wanted human connection, but couldn't tolerate the superficiality of social interactions. From this agony was born Steppenwolf, published in 1927. The novel would be his most experimental and controversial. Harry Haller, the protagonist, is a transparent alter ego of Hesse. He's a middle-aged intellectual, lonely, who sees himself as half-civilized man and half-wild wolf of the steppes. This duality tortures him. When he's among humans, the inner wolf feels disgust at the hypocrisy and mediocrity. When he's alone, the man feels the terrible loneliness of always being the outsider. Harry constantly contemplates suicide. He's marked his 50th birthday as the date when he'll allow himself to die if he still hasn't found meaning. But at the same time, he's fascinated by life, by art, by music, by thought. The genius of the novel is in how Hesse deconstructs this apparent duality. Through surreal encounters, Harry discovers he's not just divided in two, but into hundreds of contradictory selves. The man and the wolf are just crude simplifications of an infinitely more complex consciousness. The most famous part of Steppenwolf is the Magic Theatre, a hallucinatory sequence where Harry explores different doors, each revealing a different aspect of his psyche. In one room, he's a hunter assassinating cars, symbolizing his rage against technological modernity. In another, he's simultaneously all the people he's ever loved and all who've ever rejected him. In another, he confronts his own mortality. In another, he experiences pleasure without guilt. In another, he sees human history as a cosmic farce. The Magic Theatre anticipates concepts from modern psychology about the fragmented nature of consciousness. There's no true unitary self. There are multiple tendencies, desires, fears, and possibilities that coexist in tension. Sanity doesn't consist of suppressing this multiplicity, but of learning to dance with it. Hesse was exploring the same intuition that would later be developed by narrative psychology and postmodern philosophy. The self is a fluid construction, not a fixed essence. And much of human suffering comes from trying to force this multiplicity into a rigid identity. Steppenwolf also expresses Nietzschean influence more clearly than any other work by Hesse. Harry Haller represents Nietzsche's higher man, someone whose sensitivity and intellect make him incapable of accepting the mediocre values of mass society. But unlike many superficial readings of Nietzsche, Hesse doesn't celebrate this elitism. He shows how it too is a form of prison. Harry is as trapped in his contempt for the bourgeois as the bourgeois are trapped in their mediocrity. Both are incapable of simply living. The final message of the novel is that true freedom doesn't come from choosing between being the civilized man or the wild wolf, between being superior or common, between being serious or cheerful. It comes from embracing the fundamental chaos of existence, from learning to laugh at yourself, from accepting the irreducible multiplicity of life. And again, nature appears as a model. Evolution has no moral direction. It's simply life expressing itself in infinite forms. Some survive, others don't. There's no judgment. Nature is profoundly amoral, but precisely because of this, it's free from the torment of guilt and duty. For a long time, Steppenwolf was considered just another pessimistic novel in modern German literature. But in the 1960s, everything changed. The hippie counterculture discovered Hesse. Suddenly, Siddhartha and Steppenwolf were in every backpack of young Westerners traveling to India in search of enlightenment. Timothy Leary, the evangelist of LSD, cited Hesse as an influence. Rock bands like Steppenwolf, which took the novel's name, and songs like Magic Carpet Ride channeled the Hessian search for consciousness expansion. Why? Because Hesse articulated precisely what this generation felt: that modern society was spiritually dead, that traditional institutions were oppressive, that it was necessary to seek direct and authentic experience. That wisdom was in something prior to civilization, in nature, in instincts, in expanded consciousness. Hesse himself, already elderly, was ambivalent about this sudden popularity. He appreciated that young people were reading his books, but feared they were extracting a superficial message, that they saw only the rebellion and not the philosophical depth. Looking at Hesse's entire trajectory, one theme stands out above all: nature as the primordial source of meaning. From his first novels to his last works, Hesse continually returns to the idea that modern civilization has alienated us from nature. And this alienation is the root of our existential suffering. We're not thinking machines separated from the natural world. We're part of that world, expressions of the same vital force that moves trees, rivers, animals. The spiritual search, for Hesse, doesn't consist of transcending nature through religion or reason, but of returning to it. In Siddhartha, the river teaches what no human master could. In Peter Kamenzind, the protagonist finds peace in the mountains, not in libraries. In Steppenwolf, Harry's salvation comes from reconnecting with the inner wolf, the primordial instinct that civilization tried to suppress. But this isn't a simplistic message of going back to caves. Hesse doesn't romanticize primitivism. His message is more subtle. We need to integrate the wisdom of nature with the achievements of culture, instinct with intellect, animal with human. The modern tragedy is the division, not civilization itself. At the end of his long life, Hesse won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1946, belated recognition of his contribution to literature and thought. But he remained faithful to his central message: no one can teach the meaning of your life. Each person must walk their own path. Religions, philosophies, political systems all offer maps, but the territory can only be explored by yourself. The Buddha in Siddhartha achieved enlightenment, but that enlightenment was his. It couldn't be transferred. Siddhartha had to find his own enlightenment through his own unique journey. This isn't a message of simplistic relativism. Hesse isn't saying everything is valid or that each truth is equal. He's saying something deeper. That truth only becomes alive through experience. You can read all the scriptures in the world, study all the philosophers, but until you experience it directly, in your own body and mind, knowledge remains dead. It's information, not wisdom. It's map, not territory. And where can we find this path to direct experience? In nature, not in the idealized nature of romantic poets or modern ecological theories, but in visceral and immediate nature, in feeling the wind on your face, in hearing the water flow, in watching the tree grow, in recognizing the animal within us. Because nature isn't out there, we are nature. Our breath is the wind, our blood is the river, our instincts are the evolutionary wisdom of millions of years. The task isn't to study nature, but to stop resisting it, stop trying to control it, stop trying to escape from it through civilization, religion, or philosophy. The meaning of life, Hesse suggests, isn't something to be discovered or invented. It's something to be recognized as already present, flowing through us at every moment, like the river that never stops, but remains eternally the same. The question isn't where to go or what to do. The question is to stop running from who you already are. Stop trying to fit into social molds that weren't made for you. Stop believing that someone out there has the answers that only you can find. Hesse's story shows us something fundamental about the search for meaning. He didn't find the answer in a single place or moment. It wasn't Jung's therapy that saved him. It wasn't the trip to India. It wasn't literary success. It wasn't isolation in nature. It was all of this together. It was the entire path. It was the willingness to keep searching, even when everything seemed lost. This is perhaps the most important lesson he leaves us. There's no definitive moment of enlightenment after which everything is resolved. There's only the continuous process of living, of questioning, of integrating contradictory experiences. Hesse went through phases of ascetic denial, of sensual indulgence, of extreme intellectualism, of diving into the irrational. He didn't reject any of these phases as mistakes. Each was necessary for him to become who he was. It's like Siddhartha in the novel. He needed to experience worldly pleasures to understand their vacuity. He needed to reject the Buddha to find his own truth. There are no shortcuts. There's no instruction manual that works for everyone. This idea is deeply uncomfortable for our modern mind that wants efficiency, optimization, the fastest path. We want someone to tell us exactly what to do to find meaning, to be happy, to be at peace. But Hesse tells us that this very search for a universal method is part of the problem, because it comes from the same industrial mentality that transforms everything into process, into technique, into something that can be mass replicated. Enlightenment isn't manufacturable. Authenticity isn't technique. Meaning isn't a product. When we look at Hesse's work as a whole, we see that it's not just literature. It's lived philosophy, psychology in action, an honest record of an existential struggle that lasted an entire lifetime. He didn't write as a distant observer, but as someone deeply immersed in the questions he wrote about. Each novel was an attempt to understand something he was living in that moment. Peter Kamenzind was born from his restless youth. Beneath the Wheel was born from his pain with the educational system. Demian was born from his Jungian therapy. Siddhartha was born from his contemplative retreat. Steppenwolf was born from his marital and existential crisis. This makes his work unique in world literature. It's not fiction in the conventional sense. It's self-exploration through narrative. It's therapy through art. It's philosophy through lived experience. And perhaps that's why his works continue speaking so directly to so many people decades after his death. Because they're not abstract. They're born from real pain, from real confusion, from real search. Anyone who's ever felt they don't belong, who's ever questioned the meaning of everything, who's ever felt divided between what they are and what they should be, finds in Hesse a journey companion. But there's another crucial aspect in Hesse's philosophy that needs to be emphasized. His critique of modernity wasn't reactionary. He didn't want to return to some idealized past. He was pointing to something that transcends the dichotomy between tradition and modernity. Nature, as Hesse understood it, isn't the opposite of culture. It's the foundation on which any healthy culture needs to be built. The problem with modernity isn't technological progress itself, but the fact that this progress came accompanied by a profound disconnection from our animal and instinctive nature. Look, Hesse wasn't against intellect, against reason, against science. He himself was an intellectual, a sophisticated writer, someone deeply immersed in the European philosophical tradition. What he criticized was the tyranny of reason, the idea that logical and conceptual thinking is superior to all other forms of knowledge, because there are things that can't be thought, only felt. There are wisdoms that can't be articulated in words, only lived. There are truths that language inevitably distorts when trying to capture them. The river in Siddhartha doesn't teach through arguments or concepts. It teaches through its own being, through the continuous sound of its current, through the sensation of being present before it. This is a form of knowledge prior to language, prior to abstract thought. It's direct knowledge, not mediated by symbols or representations. And Hesse suggests that this type of knowledge is more fundamental, more true, than any philosophical or religious system. This has profound implications for how we live. It means that no amount of reading, of study, of accumulating information can substitute for direct experience. You can read 1,000 books about love, but until you love, you don't know what love is. You can study all the philosophies about the meaning of life, but until you find your own meaning through your own living, you're just accumulating empty concepts. Intellectual knowledge has its place, but it needs to be integrated with lived experience, with the wisdom of the body, with the intuition that comes from being totally present. Hesse was also anticipating something that only now, decades later, is becoming clearer. The ecological crisis we face isn't just a technical or political question. It's a spiritual crisis. It's the logical result of a civilization that sees itself as separate from and superior to nature. When you believe nature is just a resource to be exploited, that animals are just biological machines, that your own body is just a vehicle for your rational mind, the inevitable result is destruction. Destruction of the environment, destruction of mental health, destruction of meaning. Hesse's message is that we need a fundamental reconciliation. We can't continue living as if we were pure spirits imprisoned in animal bodies. We can't continue treating our instincts as enemies to be suppressed. We can't continue believing that civilization is the final victory over wild nature. Because we are nature, there's no separation, and the more we try to separate ourselves, the more we suffer. But how to make this reconciliation? Hesse doesn't offer a step-by-step method, because again, each person needs to find their own path. For some, it might be through art, through painting, through music. For others, through meditation, through silent contemplation. For others, through physical work, through direct contact with the earth. For others, through love, through total surrender to another person. For others, through solitude, through retreat, through confronting themselves. There's no universal recipe. What there is a general direction, moving toward authenticity, constantly asking yourself, am I living according to who I really am? Or am I trying to fit into a form that isn't mine? Am I listening to my inner voice, or just repeating what I was taught? Am I present in my life, or just going through it automatically? These questions don't have simple answers, but asking these questions, keeping these questions alive, is already a beginning. Hesse lived this philosophy until the end. He spent his last years in Montagnola, painting, writing, observing nature. Not as a guru or teacher, but as someone who simply lived according to his own truth. He never founded a school of thought, never had disciples, never tried to create a system, because that would betray everything he believed in. Each person must find their own path. He just showed his, in the hope that it could inspire others to seek their own. When he died in 1962, he left a body of work that continues speaking to all those who feel they don't belong, who question, who search. But he left us without ready answers, only with the invitation to embark on our own journey. And perhaps that's the greatest gift a writer can give. Not packaged solutions, but the recognition that your questions are valid, that your search has meaning, that you're not alone in this struggle to find authenticity in a world that constantly pushes us toward conformity. And that's exactly what we seek here. Hesse said each person must walk their own path, but he also knew that sharing each other's journeys makes us stronger. If you've made it this far, this kind of reflection is probably already part of your path. That's why I created the Philosophical Forge, a training program with 10 video lessons designed to help you apply the philosophy developed by great thinkers to your personal and professional life and build a mind that is wiser, more rational, and less ruled by emotions. Start 2026 by transforming your life and investing in what truly matters. You. Check the first pinned comment and get your 10% discount coupon. See you in the next video.